Okay, so I've been thinking about, or I guess like the topic that's been on my mind is like, why is life so hard? Well, specifically right now, right? Because if we're being honest, if we look at it in a particular lens, or anybody who's very familiar with the history of humanity, right, you can really look and see that relative to all of human history, life isn't hard right now, right? Like, I think there's I wouldn't say it's a problem, but there's I guess you could say a feature of humanity in that we get used to things. We get used to things that make us comfortable and we want more, right? Now, it could be seen as a bad thing, and I'm not phrasing it like a bad thing because without that you wouldn't have the amount of progress that we've had as human beings in society, right? We wouldn't have the ability to learn and become better. We wouldn't have the ability to do things better, right? So, and I think that's an important thing to remember, at least, or at least to put this in proper context, because it's a common conversation nowadays that everything is harder, that making money is harder, that relationships are harder, that owning a home is harder, and that is true, right? Because relative to the prosperity that the world had, I guess you could say between about like the 1970s to about the 1990s, right? Compared to those times, things are on average, or I guess you could say per capita, per person, harder, right? Because no matter what, every time period you go through, you'll find people who have been having a hard time, right? Especially among the people group that we call black people, right? A lot of us would argue that we've always had it hard, right? But even still, even among black people, it's still particularly hard compared to how quite a few of our parents had it and grandparents, right? Maybe not in regards to things like, I guess you could say racism and race relations, but in regards to quality of life and quality of living, right? Because everybody needs like I like to say all the time, it's like a triangle, right? Like a wealth triangle of sorts. You have shelter, then you have food, then you have transportation, right? And basically how things are gonna basically feel for people in regards to like life difficulty is gonna go according to how much people can have all of that on the basic level, right? And so, and the reason why I'm saying that is because, like I said earlier, if you're looking at all of human history, like if human beings from like the 1700s or even the 1800s came and saw how we're living now, they would wonder, what is everybody complaining about, right? They'd be very confused, right? Because if you take an overall look at humanity up until now, a lot of things have improved, right? Uh, Particularly within what we call the Western world, in Western society, uh, even homeless people have a hard time going hungry, right? So what we're feeling is relative to the level of comfort that humanity has achieved, right, since those times, right? Like there was a point in time when air conditioning and heat didn't exist, right? So those are things to think about in regards to that, right? I'm not trying to promote a we can have it worse mindset, but the point of that kind of thinking is to balance out and keep yourself in a more positive equilibrium, right? Because there's people who are actually, if you actually look at their situation, they're in a relatively good situation, but because they're not achieving, or because they're not at the level that they feel like they should be at, they're damn near ready to crash out, right? Or they do crash out, right? They go and they do something stupid, right? Or something that, that makes sense to them because they're looking at their relative conditions, right? And I think it's the lack of perspective that can make us feel like life is just this dastardly difficult and hard thing to live with, right? Or live through, maybe put it that way, right? But here's where people do have a point, because as I said, is the natural thing within human beings for us to want to do better, to want to be more, and want to become more, right? And I think this is like an actual statistic. I can't remember exactly how it went. I'm kind of paraphrasing it, but basically, the generations born what they would call millennials, right, in the 80s and 90s, and then Gen Z would be like, early 2000s, and then after that, I think they call them Gen Alpha, right, and Gen X is like everybody born in the 70s. But basically, millennials and the generations after, right, like basically everybody born in the 90s and afterwards, are the first generations of people that are not progressing on average, right, that are not doing better than our parents did, right, that are not doing better than our grandparents did. We're the first generation. I was born in 1994, so I'd be counted as a millennial, right? So, but basically, a lot of people, it's kind of like the whole expectations versus reality thing. And that's the thing that's kind of really getting people caught up, that there was a lot of expectations that were thrown onto us, whether it be by parents or by society or just, the like societal standards, right? Or people who had hopes and dreams, because we were the generation that was growing up and getting taught that like we can be anything, we can do anything. Then Barack Obama became president, and that made anybody, because everybody's like, man, if a black guy can become president in America, we all can make it with whatever we want to do, right? Like it was almost like that, right? And then it was almost like, in a certain way, something about how things started to go economically in combination with things like the pandemic and all that kind of really start to shift gears in the mood that people had, right? And now it's like even worse now after, the economy is getting much worse and it's getting much tougher now. So I think, things are relatively harder, right? As I said, compared to like, if we're comparing it within this era of prosperity within recent history, right? But overall, for the whole of human history, like, it's almost like how they say life is ups and downs, right? And I think if we're looking at the human body and the existence of humanity as a whole life, right, naturally the existence of humanity is going to have ups and downs, right? Because even if you look through all of human history from the world beginnings until now, right, there's like the period before what we call the medieval era, right? I think it's referred to as a classical era, right? If you go and you look into it, things were relatively more prosperous, particularly say in areas like Rome, Greece, and stuff like that. It was more prosperous and more enlightened than what they call the Dark Ages, right? Because there's knowledge that was lost, things that just ended up lost, right? There are certain technologies that in the ancient world that ended up lost to time and all that. There's things that were built, such as the pyramids in Egypt, that to this day they're not certain on how it was actually built, right? And strangely, we don't even have the tools at this point in time to create something like that. So there's this big wonder on how that was even done, right? So, and while some people think it's some kind of technology, that's kind of a side note, but I think it was probably maybe more so some sort of technique and a way of building that they understood back in those times, right? Things like that are lost to time, right? But what I'm getting at is throughout the whole of humanity, we've had periods of ups and downs. We had periods where things were better, and we had periods where things were worse, right? So I think if we can learn to look at things in that perspective, things will be a lot better. Things will go a lot better in regards to at least how people are feeling about life in the time that we're in, right? And if we stop having what I think at least is unrealistic expectations for the majority of people, because we're almost at a point where everybody wants to be prosperous, everybody wants to be rich, everybody wants to be a millionaire or a billionaire, everybody wants to retire their parents and all this kind of stuff, right? But it's if you were looking at the human body like it was like one life, right? The human body is kind of like at a point in time. Like let's say if a person's at a point in time in life, let's say like how usually people are living during college, right? During the college ages of like 18 to like 22 and stuff like that, right? During that time period, nobody expects you to have a lot of money to spend. Nobody expects you to, be able to buy this and buy that and buy all that kind of stuff. That stuff is more so, well, at least before was expected when you're 30. Now that stuff is like starting to be expected when you're 40, just because how things have gone economically, right? But I think if we kind of look at the human body like we're in a period like that, or we're in a period where it's just harder, right? It can give us more clarity. It can give us better perspective. It can give us better understanding, right? and it gives us the ability to adjust our expectations, right? And maybe we should maybe try to be a bit easier on ourselves, right? Not in the sense that we shouldn't hope to achieve anything, but maybe if we look at it with a realer perspective, it won't seem so hard.